Welcome to .reddit, where today 911 operators reveal stories that you simply cannot forget. If you are new to my channel, please smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Not me, but my sister is a dispatcher. One time she received a call from a man who said he just killed his sister and brother. She kept him on the phone for 5 or 6 minutes to make sure he didn't run before officers arrived. She got him to admit they had all been drinking and playing cards, then got into an argument when one of them accused the other of cheating. The other two went to bed, but this guy stayed up stewing. Apparently he couldn't let it go. He shot each of them in their beds while they slept, then called 911. I heard a partial recording of the call and she sounded calm AF. She told me she was screaming on the inside the entire time. Older lady, I want to say maybe early 70s, calls in with a sort of polite urgency in her voice, tells me she thinks she's having a stroke, tells me she has her grandchild at the house with her, asks me to call her daughter to come get the child. By the time she's done giving me the phone number there's just a very slight slur in her speech. By the time Ems got there, probably no more than 5 minutes or so, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying. Fascinating, disturbing, and profoundly sad hearing someone stroke out on the phone as they're talking to you. Had someone call saying a man had been killed by a goat. Turns out goat is what they also call a machine that picks oranges off of trees. Miscommunication can be horrifying. I'll go with the lighter one. I once had an elderly woman complain that gang members tagged her shed. She also said she didn't want a black deputy. This is the South. The black deputy arrived and found that it wasn't spray paint, but that her shed was so dirty that slugs had eaten paths in the filth that created patterns. A woman masturbating on the phone. The first time she called she sounded normal at first. Asked for an officer. That never worked here. General conversation about this officer, while she progressively got more extreme with her moaning. I eventually, and gracefully, ended the conversation. It was a wild time. I still remember her name and voice. The second and third time she called I asked if it was her, and she hung up right away. Why are you like this, Ms. Roberts? What is your end game? Edit. For clarification, we traced the number down to a woman in Florida. We are located in Missouri and our agency is tiny. Part of why I like this job. Hunting her down and bringing her to justice wouldn't have been worth the hassle. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years in a medium-sized center, population 180. We have more than our share of crazy calls, but there are only a few calls that have stuck with me. For me, the ones that I can't get rid of aren't even close to being the craziest or most brutal. 7 to 8 years ago I took a 911 call from a man who came home to find his adult sister had been raped and beaten. The suspect had wrapped a telephone cord around her neck then tried to push her through the window of the apartment. He was understandably very distraught. She was still alive and was able to talk to me. She had not been blindfolded, and I was certain I could get a description of the person who had done this to her. She answered all of my other questions, but absolutely refused to give me any info on the suspect. I later found out that the reason was self-preservation. The person who did it was the brother who called 911 for help. He was so believable it really messed with my head. I also felt horrible that I had continued pressing her for info with the person who hurt her was right there, and that I could have potentially put her in more danger without realizing. A young man 23 years old called and told me he was going to commit suicide. He was my first call of my shift that day, very early in the morning. He planned to set his car on fire with himself inside. He was upset and crying, but he apologized to me. He said he was sorry I picked up the phone, and he was sorry for how this was going to affect me. He hung up on me, and the second time I was speaking to him, I could hear liquid splashing in the background. He ended hanging up again, and I never got him back. He did end up setting the on fire, and it was fully engulfed by the time anyone got there. I'll never forget his name or voice and I simply hope I showed him kindness and compassion in his last moments. Edit. Thank you for the gold and silver kind strangers. I appreciate all the comments. I'm fine. I'm lucky enough to have an amazing support system in my co-workers and I have an awesome spouse to keep me grounded. This call made me a better dispatcher. It's easy to become desensitized to the horrific things we hear, and this young man renewed my passion for helping people. answered to the sounds of a couple of women absolutely screaming and wailing. I'm sure anyone that has done the job long enough knows the type of scream I mean. That blood-curdling scream of someone in genuine anguish. Knew something was up and got police and ambulance on the way. Trying to get them on the phone to get details, and a boy of no more than 5 years old comes on the phone and says my daddy is swinging from the roof and his eyes are open and staring. He had hung himself while his family were out doing their shopping. For me, the worst ones are always the calls you can relate to on a personal level. I took a call last month from a father who discovered his son with a bag over his head and a note next to his body. I've taken a ton of suicide calls, but this one was particularly difficult for me because the son was my age, and the way the father pleaded with his son was almost exactly the same way I've imagined my dad if I were to ever do the same. I've had the same "come on, buddy, don't do this to me" running in my head at least 2 to 3 times a day since. Also, not technically a call, but my first shift on my own. I dispatched the deputy I did my ride along with to a domestic that he ended up being shot and killed at. Hearing his blood-gurgled shots fired scream on the radio won't be something I'll ever forget. A woman complaining of spiders in her vagina. In college, I worked as an EMT in a major city. Not the craziest call I ever had, but one of the wackiest call-outs we ever got was to respond to a woman complaining of spiders in her vagina. I'll never forget pulling up to this major intersection where, sure enough, there's this old lady lying on the sidewalk with her pants off and legs spread up in the air. Turns out it was this transient lady in her 70s who had been having some wild hallucinations. We still had to check for spiders. That sounds like the happier ending. How exactly would one deal with a recluse in the cooch, digging around in a hallucinating 70-year-old's vagina on the side of the road? I'm sorry, but I'd take the spiders. Repost of my comment from a similar question a while ago. On my second full-time shift, it was about 11 PM on a Thursday. We get a call from a female, screaming, just screaming. That's all we heard. We lost connection. Second 911 call from the neighbor across the street. I think I just heard a gunshot and now our neighbor is screaming, yelling for help. I think something terrible happened. While my partner was getting more info from caller #2, 911 rings again, and it's the original caller. She's still screaming, but is trying to speak, even though I can't understand anything she's saying. After a couple very stern verbal slaps of "ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me what is going on," she's finally able to tell me that she thinks her husband just killed himself. She went on to explain that they were watching a TV show together. Everything seemed normal when he got up and said that he would be right back. Wife heard the back deck door open and close, and then she heard a gunshot. She ran to the door and just saw his feet and legs lying down on the deck. She called initially, but was unable to control herself and accidentally hung up. She was still a complete disaster when I talked to her, but I was able to get the basics of what happened and relay the info to responding officers and fire. She kept telling me that she needed to go outside and help him. Do I need to go out there? Do you need me to go out there? I don't want to see him. I can't see him. My only job at that point was to try and keep her calm and keep her from getting up from the corner of the kitchen floor where she had collapsed until police arrived and secured the weapon. They had been married 27 years, 2 kids, 3 grandkids, lived a happy life together. She had no indication that anything was wrong. Her husband got up from the couch, walked out onto the back porch, and blew his head off with a black powder pistol. I don't remember her name, but I will never be able to forget her screams. I've left the job now for pastures new, but story time. Woman of 90 years old calls up and says she's having a spot of trouble. She's struggling to work the phone and tells me she basically had a leg ulcer which has popped and that she's on blood thinners, so there's a lot of blood coming out. I get an ambulance out immediately to her, but midway through the call it goes silent and I hear a big ol' thud on the floor. After this, I try my best to basically shout down the phone after her to get her attention. All I can hear is very heavy breathing but no reply. This continues for a couple of minutes before I hear banging on the other end of the line and a voice faintly shouting the lady's name. I keep trying to rouse her myself, but I'm unsuccessful. I hear the window break and a couple of voices approaching. They reach her, and thankfully I hear her very faint voice respond. Normally we don't find out what happens, but in this case I actually received a letter and chocolates from the lady who sent it in and said that she could hear me the whole time and felt reassured that help was coming, but she didn't have the strength to reply. For what was a really shitty job at the time, getting that made the next few months really easy. Oh my goodness, that really is. I can't think of the word, but I'm glad everything turned out good and wholesome.